Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to The Money Factor. I'm Richard Naylor, your host. One of the most important things that a manager does is to hire employees. There's a lot of things we can do to try to make it better, but it's not easy. One tool that's often overlooked is a background check. Our guest today is Michelle Pyan, President of Commercial Investigations. She's here to help us out and sort through that part of the possibilities. I want to welcome you, Michelle, to the show.
Thanks, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
Background checks is not something that I've grown up with. It's a little unusual. Could you tell us more about your company and how you got into it?
Sure. My company's been around since 2004, but I started as a private investigator in Wisconsin back in 1991 and actually ran my first background check back then. There's been a few people in the industry about 2 more decades earlier than that, but it's really only been since the late 1990s that background checks have really become more popular. And in the last probably about 5 or 6 years have they even risen to a higher level of popularity. They estimate that probably about 85% of Fortune 100 companies are doing background checks.
How much was that?
About 85%.
85%.
Yeah, now that's the larger organizations, obviously. It gets a lot less. Probably about 35% across the board are doing background checks at this point in time. So it is a growth industry. I'm a licensed private investigator in New York, and I had worked for a couple of organizations within New York, and 3 years ago I decided to start commercial investigations, and I have a couple of other partners, but I am the licensed private investigator that holds the license. We do probably about 95% of our business is background checks, and the majority of that is employment background checks. We'll do some tenant background checks, mergers and acquisitions, and other types of corporate investigative background work. But it's really the standard pre-employment check, pre-employment screening type of service that we offer.
So it ranges from a casual, did this person really take these classes, to tell me everything you can tell me about this person. It's a sensitive job.
Exactly, yep. I want to buy this person's company and I want to know what type of person they are, how extensive can you be and get us some information. And then we can dig really deep and do some pretty extensive background checks. But the really basic is the pre-employment. Is there any criminal history? That's probably the majority of what we do is criminal history searches.
Let's go into some of the reasons why people are motivated. I guess that's an important thing. And feel it's justified to go through whatever extra expense there's going to be to do a background check.
Sure. Probably the underlying principle comes from negligent hiring through the common law, where an employer should have known that its employee had the propensity to commit such an act, be it violence against a client or theft, internally embezzlement type of situation. So the doctrine of negligent hiring applies to the employer, and they're responsible for those employees' acts. So to protect themselves on the should have known, they need to know what they should have known, and the only way to really know that is to do a background check, to look into the person's background.
Now that would apply the fact that they could actually commit a crime for which the company would ultimately bear some responsibility. Would that be on the job kind of thing?
Generally it is on the job. There's been a very few cases where the employee acted outside of the job and the employer was held liable. A situation would be where it's a healthcare worker who may have been assigned to a certain person in a home care setting.
I see.
And they're not on duty, but they go back and rape or murder the individual or steal from them that they were responsible for caring for. The only way that they knew that person is through their employment. And even though it occurred off the job, it's because of that employment connectivity that the employer was held liable.
So let's go through some of the different reasons now in types of jobs that would motivate someone.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are probably some jobs where it's so obvious that, like a bookkeeper for a company that, where they're going to give fairly amount of control to this person, where they could do some real money damage, would be one that they would probably think of.
Right. Yeah, it's estimated approximately 42% of small businesses that fail due to some type of employee impropriety.
That's huge.
It is. It is. So the small business owner out there really needs to be aware of what's available for them to protect themselves from that type of situation. So obviously, if you're going to give somebody check writing, cash handling authority, you want to make sure they don't have a history of any type of petty larceny or embezzlement, anything that may even get them interested in perhaps taking money from you, such as like a high debt load. When you do a credit report and you see the person's really overextended, that's a great example of a time to do a credit report,
Right.
is when it's a finance type of position.
And I suppose a previous drug conviction could be a big flag?
That would be a big flag from a number of areas, but especially financial, because you got to feed that habit.
Right. I know I saw somewhere on your website something about, was it a cocaine or some kind of a drug which has now caused a lot more business?
Right. I think it's probably meth, with
That's right.
methamphetamines.
Right.
Yeah. It's really starting to become popular, and you hear about all these little meth labs, and people can make meth from standard materials like some of the cold medications that now you have to sign for.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's a very addictive drug as well. And we actually just this week had a drug test come back positive for methamphetamines. So it's very interesting that it's starting to really take off. They call it like the soccer mom drug, because it gives you like a high and you have all this energy and you can't sleep and you're just go, go, go. But then it's so addictive that the people really get sucked into the drug.
And then they need money. Things I see in the newspaper where you see white-collar crime connected to violence, it seems like it's often either gambling or drug-related.
Yeah. Probably. People are just, they get so tied into it and so driven that they'll do whatever they can for that habit.
Now, those are crimes that may or may not, I guess, be connected to a job, but in terms of drugs, I'm not sure if that's not connected to anything.
Yeah. Depending upon the situation, obviously, as an employer, a drug test is pretty popular. Among certain industries, it's required. It was really popular in the 1980s. Drug testing was out there pretty much standard, mainstream, kind of declined a little bit, and now it's on the rise again, mainly due to methamphetamines. And just liability is an issue. The insurance companies have really stepped up and said, you know, we'll renew your insurance policy, but you have to do drug testing or background checks. And some of this is being driven by the insurance industry as well.
Okay. Well, once you've hired them, it's a little late to worry about the background check, or is it not?
You can do a background check after you hire somebody. Most employers will do background checks when they promote somebody to another position.
Okay.
Kind of gives them a good time to renew the information that they have, make sure there's nothing else out there. If they implemented a background check policy since the person had started, they may not even have an original background check on the person, so they're promoting them, then it's a good time to do a background check. As far as drug testing, there's random drug testing that some employers will implement, and then just in the random pool, a certain percentage of employees will be pulled every month.
Do you ever have a company that wants you to do some background checks on employees they already have, and they thought they should have probably done this before, but they didn't, and now they're realizing they should have, and they just wonder?
We've had a couple of situations, and that's more of our PI hat versus our background check hat, and we'll come in and do an investigation. And
Now,
it is
PI,
into the
public investigation, or
private investigator.
Private.
Yeah, there's some different laws that apply to the different types of information that we get, but we'll come in and look at a certain group of employees. Take, for instance, a healthcare facility has a locked lab. 6 individuals have access to the lab, and certain drugs are disappearing from the lab, and those 6 employees sign a consent form to do a background check, so we run the same background check on the 6. We find a history in the past of one of them, and the person ends up leaving the position, and the theft stops. So there are cases where we'll be called in to look at that type of situation.
Now, what are the rules if you ask someone to sign a consent form and they decline? Can you do anything about that?
Most of the time on a pre-employment basis, it's a lot easier than when they're a current employee.
Right,
That's a
because
tough
you're not
decision.
required to hire them, but what about after?
Some people will make it a condition of continued employment, and most jobs are employment at will, so
Well, that's
if
true.
you're not unionized, you can go ahead and do that. We've had a few companies come in, and it was driven by the insurance company or driven by some type of internal situation, and they just wanted to do it. They talked to the employees, and they signed off, and we ran everybody's background checks.
So we have the cases where a person who is maybe indicated they might be more likely to commit a crime is screened in some way from doing so by a background check. Now, there must be some things that are maybe red flags, but some are just orange, or I don't know if that's a good example. We have all these colors these days. That, would you want to use those in all situations? How do you decide whether something is relevant or not?
Well, we comply with the various laws, and in New York State, an employer can get criminal conviction information, the definition of a crime being a misdemeanor or felony. So any misdemeanor or felony conviction information is passed on to the employer. Then they have to kind of make a determination from there. And under the New York State corrections law, there's a number of criteria they have to look at, like how long has it been, how does it relate to the job, and some other criteria, any rehabilitation paperwork that the subject may have brought to the table, information like that. So we work with individuals and we help them. We don't provide legal advice and we don't make the ultimate decision, but we do provide guidance in, that was petty larceny. It was 7 years ago and the person was 19.
Maybe it was shoplifting and they're in sales or something.
Right, which could be a concern because it does relate to the position.
Well, that's true. They probably have samples and who knows what.
Exposure to the merchandise and the stock that they might be able to help themselves with.
So that's the kind of a thing that could really be applicable to everyone, is any kind of thievery.
Yes. Integrity, honesty, that type of information, that's what you get out of a background check, a little bit more than when you're looking at somebody across the table during a half an hour or hour interview. When you look at the background check, you can look at a credit report. How responsible are they with their credit information? How risky are they? What kind of infractions or information is on their driving history? They have a lot of speeding tickets and accidents that they're
So you can get
really
that detail, not just that they have 12 points, and then that gives you a little more idea that if it's really relevant.
Right, and the type of person they are, their characteristics. So the more different types of inquiries, the types of information you pull together, the more of a picture of that person you start to put together. If we do a reference or two with a past supervisor, and we ask a series of questions, you really learn about the person's character and how they react to certain situations, and you look at that in conjunction with these other searches, you're starting to develop an idea of what this person's all about.
Could you give an idea about, you mentioned a few types of information, obviously driving, credit, convictions. What other types of information might be relevant?
Probably the biggest one is probably about 85 to 90% of our background checks start with some type of social security number and address verification. What that does is it validates that is a valid social security number. It'll give us names and addresses associated with the individual. This is really useful, especially these days when they talk about all the immigration. We've had a few situations where we've found a few illegal immigrant rings. We had one where there was 21 different names associated with the same social security number.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a legitimate social security number, but none of the people using it was the person that it was issued to. So it's just a very basic piece of information. It's very low cost, usually just a couple of dollars, and you can really just tell, has the person moved frequently because you see the time frames they lived at each address. What kind of name or name variations have they used? Every once in a while we'll get a mail that has used a couple of different names. That's always interesting. Why are they going by a couple of different names? Probably
not all official.
Right. Yeah, they're not. And a lot of them in that situation do have a criminal history.
And that would be a good reason to change it. And today with the sex lists, this must be pretty difficult for someone who's been on that list and could be a motivation to change or try to change something.
Yeah, there's a lot of people on those sex offender lists, and there's a lot of people that should be on the list that aren't. And those are situations where they would, change something so that they could try to live outside of that.
Do some people feel that they shouldn't do a background check for some ethical reason, that they feel that it's prying?
Probably when you look at the different types of information, the credit report is kind of held at a little higher level of privacy, and I'll go in and talk to some prospective clients, and they'll be like, oh, we won't do credit reports, or management won't allow that, we got to run that by the board. So they're very conscientious about the types of details that come back on a credit report, and it is really gray. It's not black and white like felony conviction, no felony conviction.
Right.
It's just a lot of information, and you got to really decipher it and figure out what is applicable and what isn't. So that's probably the biggest situation. You know, there's also other employers that say, well, if I ran background checks, I wouldn't have anybody to hire.
But that can't be true.
Well, you know, not really. I mean, on its face, you kind of see what they're saying, but you look at, you put levels to it. You know, we do have a few.
I guess unless they were in organized crime, that could be a...
Right. Yeah, that's true.
It would be a negative or something. But.
Right, right. But, you know, you can say, you know, misdemeanor's okay, felony isn't. It just depends upon the type of work. You know, employers need employees to do the job and
Right.
to produce their product, but you also have to protect your other employees and your clientele.
So they do have limits, and I guess they probably have a sensitivity to a certain type of information, maybe because for their own reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Many people don't want to give their Social Security number at all, and so they're all worried about somebody finding out the number and using it.
Right, right. In the employment setting, though, it's been so standard to give the Social Security
You
number
have
that
to,
it
right?
isn't.
You can't
Yeah,
pay taxes without that.
right. We can't really do a good background check without that, and the date of birth and the name. So those are the three. The fourth criteria is the address. So those are how we match up all the different searches depending upon what data elements we're searching.
Right. Of course, the address changes probably quite a bit, but the other ones should be pretty good.
Right.
My birthday's never going to change, for example.
Yeah, you'd hope not. But it's it's interesting. Sometimes people do put down.
Sometimes they change.
Yeah, yeah, and we've got ways to double check that.
Okay.
Criminal records are really held by name, then date of birth, and there's a lot of common names out there, and so if you don't have an accurate date of birth, you may not get a criminal record. And some of the individuals who are learning the system are finding that that's probably one of the ways that they think they can manipulate the system. And it does work to a certain point, but then the background screening companies run checks on the data elements supplied to make sure that they're accurate before going to the next level and running a criminal history with that date of birth.
Now, it seems like it's obviously a good idea to do a background check. I don't think anybody would say, no, that's a stupid thing to do. And yet some people don't do it. I think there's so much pressure on everybody to get things done, to get that employee in. I need somebody tomorrow. Somebody just quit. You must get that all the time.
We do. Or this morning I ran into somebody at a networking event and they hired the person. They still want to do the background check, but they needed to get them in the door. So they end up doing it after the person starts. They make a conditional job offer, condition on the background check, but it just takes them a while to get the background check going. And it happens a lot in smaller organizations that may not have a dedicated HR person or somebody really dedicated to follow the process from 1 through 10 in order and get it done. And they'll come around eventually and get it done. But yeah, it's just a matter of staying on top of it. The larger organizations, somebody's assigned to that. It takes us about 1.5 to 2 days to turn it around. Most of them will wait for the background check, then
it's
make
nothing.
the offer.
Yeah.
It isn't. No, it's really pretty quick to get the background check information. So it's really worth it.
So unless they really needed an in-depth investigation, it would happen within a week.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Even some of our in-depth investigations are wrapped up in 2 weeks.
Okay. What kind of other things can they get at in terms of information? Are there anything that would be interesting that I hadn't thought of information on people that might be of interest?
One of the things that's really at the forefront in our industry right now is the searching of social networking sites. And it kind of stems from your basic Google search, but then people are going into MySpace, Facebook, Reunion.com, other types of social networking sites, and searching their applicants, even before they'll interview them, sometimes after interview, to try to find out what information is available on this individual on the internet. And we work with a company, we do some of our own searching along those lines, but employers are more and more doing a little bit of that themselves.
So that's something that everybody can do.
Right.
Do you find that there's an ethical issue there? Of course, on the one hand, there's freedom of speech, but on the other hand, there's freedom of hiring.
It's interesting, and it is in the ethical dilemma area
Okay.
within the industry. However, it's public information. And I think it just stems from the people don't realize that it's public information. They're putting the information out there thinking that their friends are accessing it and having a good time, but they never put the privacy setting on their account, so everybody's accessing it, and they're out there applying for jobs and all this information's out there. So it's more the subjects becoming aware of the fact that this is public data, and at first crying, privacy, you know, what are you doing? You shouldn't be looking at this. And it's really kind of come around to the point where, like, the placement offices of the colleges will work with the individuals who will be graduating, and they will tell them, clean up your website, clean up your stuff that's out there. Employers are going to look at this. So it's become a little bit more accepted, but it's still somewhat of an ethical issue. One of the things that comes into play is when you use a third party, like commercial investigations, to do your background checks, you have to follow the Fair Credit Reporting Act and other applicable state laws. When an employer does their own investigations, they don't necessarily have to. The Fair Credit Reporting Act provides protection for the consumer, being the subject. There has to be a pre-adverse notice with a copy of the report, an adverse notice.
Could you define that for us?
Sure. Say you're not going to hire somebody because you get information in our report that's negative, like a criminal history, to make it real easy, and that applies to the job. Theft in a retail situation, not going to hire them. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the employer has to give the subject a pre-adverse action notice and a copy of the report.
Now, what does pre-adverse mean?
Okay, it's before the adverse action is taken.
I see.
And adverse action is going to be where they fill the position with somebody other than that candidate. So before they actually take that, they have to give the subject a chance to perhaps dispute the information and get it corrected. There's a lot of data involved, a lot of room for human error, and so this is kind of like the consumer recourse, kind of similar to changing information on your credit report with the credit bureaus. Well, this is with the background screening companies. Give the pre-adverse, they have about 5 days, and then they get the adverse action notice, and then the employer goes ahead and hires somebody else. So there's these protections that exist that when an employer does its own investigation, they don't fall under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So coming back to the ethical considerations in searching this type of social information, it becomes, well, that employer never has to tell that person that they didn't get the job because they had this picture that the employer felt was not a good representation of themselves and perhaps their company should they be hired, and they never have a chance for recourse or to know why. So probably the biggest ethical cry of wrongdoing is coming along more of those areas. So it's advantageous more for an employer to use a service and to comply with the pre-adverse and the adverse action in the Fair Credit Reporting Act when they use a third party.
Then you know it's done right.
Right, right. And they can also, like with our services and others in the industry, they can say, I don't really want to know about alcohol situations. Alcohol is legal. It's not occurring on the job. Obviously, if it was an on-the-job issue, we'd want to know about that, but we don't want to know about that. But illegal stuff, talking about some type of theft or drug use or something like that, we want to know about that. So the employer can put their parameters on it. So instead
then they won't even hear about it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Versus their HR person stumbling upon it when they're doing their own Google search or something.
Now, what's the difference between a company with an H&R department and the smaller business that has no H&R department? They are H&R as well as the tax department and the bookkeeper, and maybe they write the checks. HR departments are probably much more likely to be availing themselves of a commercial service, while the standalone, the sole proprietor, probably is tempted to pass it up.
Yeah, it's another step in the hiring process. It's another cost involved, but it's also just a great way for them to get another look at the person and really protect their business, because it is usually small businesses. With some companies, there's kind of barriers to entry when you're looking at background checks. You have to find the right company out there that's going to work with the small to mid-sized employer and isn't going to say, well, we only work with somebody who hires 10 people a year and gives us that volume. Otherwise, you have to pay an exorbitant amount just to get a background check. So you got to find the right company to work with, and a lot of times they're afraid of the compliance involved, like we talked about the Fair Credit Reporting Act, afraid of, the forms, there's certain forms and certain legal wording and stuff that comes under these acts, and it's just another compliance issue for them to undertake, and so that kind of stops them sometimes. But we try to do some educational situations similar to this or some presentations, try to let people know that it's really not that bad, and there's a lot of companies out there that are going to help you through it, help you understand, and it's really advantageous. It's probably going to cost you less than the first day's pay for that person, and it would be just so worth your investment to try it.
I saw a number, I was surprised. $60?
Yes, that was our March average. When I was putting together some numbers I ran, we did so many background checks at so much gross, and it was $60 on average a background check ran for the month of March through our company. Very economical. You know, some run upwards of $100, $130.
So it's not too bad. What can a person do on their own if they for some reason don't want to hire somebody? What's the limit of what they could probably do on their own?
Okay. Well, you know, we did talk about like the Google search or the social networking searches. There's also the various states have the sex offender registry. There's a national sex offender registry as well. So you can go on, you could search that. In New York State, you can go direct to the department and get all 3-level sex offender registry search. Either call them or fax them. Online is going to get you level 3. I know they were thinking about adding level 2 to that, but you're still missing the level 1 sex offenders. So you can go right to the state and get that information as far as sex offender registry check. And a lot of the states have Department of Corrections data available. That's anybody who's been in prison. So that would be a felony conviction with a year or more of prison time. Yes. And one of the great things about New York's Department of Corrections is it's not just current inmates, it's past inmates too. So you can get inmate information about somebody, including the level of crime they were convicted of and what county they were convicted in, just by going to the Department of Corrections website.
And of course, that's the only one that matters probably, because the other ones aren't applying right now.
Right. Exactly.
Now, we don't have a lot more time, but I wanted to cover some really almost mundane things. I read some numbers, maybe it was on your website or somewhere else, that some number of people don't accurately put down their experience and their education. Do you have any numbers?
It ranges, but the general is like 10% of people have a criminal record. But when it comes to education, that's the most misrepresented piece of information, and I've heard numbers up to like 40%.
Wow.
But that's like they misrepresent the GPA, they still got the degree. They misrepresent the degree as being a BS and it's an AAS. A slight misrepresentation versus having it or not having it.
Okay.
But education is probably the most misrepresented piece of information.
Shows it's valued, I guess.
Yes. Yes.
Now, is that very easy to check though? Because if I think I've got to figure out where to reach the college and I'm busy, so
right.
It does seem difficult.
It's obviously, as a background screening company, we have certain things in-house, but this day and age with Google, it's pretty quick to pull up, you know, if you search registrars and the name of the school, you're probably going to get the number right for registrars. You call them up, you tell them you want to verify a degree. Sometimes you have to fax them a consent form and the request in writing, and then you'll get the information back. Sometimes,
because you could be dealing with schools and state laws all around the country.
Right. Right. So yeah, they like to have it in writing a lot of times. So you should have some type of consent form that the subject signs in conjunction with the hiring paperwork. Just makes it easier later on. Some employers will have the subject bring in a copy of their diploma, and this day and age with the type of copy and printing capabilities that are out there, there's so many fake degrees out there that's just not a really good way to go when it comes to validating education.
Right. Do you have any tips on the other side of the coin for the job applicant? Because now we're talking about those people that maybe fudge the GPA a little bit.
Right. Don't fudge.
Don't fudge. It's an easy one.
Probably one of the things I do talk to a lot of subjects who don't get the position or who just are referred to me from my networking and want some help, can't understand why they're not getting a job and stuff like that. And we'll take a step back and look at their information. And people don't realize that they really were convicted of a crime, and a crime is a misdemeanor or a felony. Not just felony, misdemeanor too. So people are out there and they're misrepresenting their criminal past. Some are doing it intentionally and some aren't. And if people had a run-in with the law, they really should go out there and go back to the court, find out what information's out there, find out what level it's at. If it was supposed to be sealed or adjourned in contemplation of dismissal, make sure that that did happen. It's really worth your time, and we help people with that. We'll do it for people, but we prefer that they do it for themselves as well. That's probably one of the biggest things, is don't misrepresent your criminal history. Most employers are, you know, if they only would have told me, we still would have hired them, but I can't hire them because they falsified their hiring documentation. Most crimes don't have a bearing upon getting the job or not. It's the truthfulness of the applicant.
And if you'll lie about a small thing, what's the chance it'll be a little bigger?
Yeah, depending upon the circumstances, you get a little more pressure, it's going to get bigger, you don't know.
Right, right. Anything else you'd like to, that I didn't cover, that you'd like people to know about?
I just think that people shouldn't be afraid about background checks and compliance, and you know, it's really something that businesses are embracing, insurance companies are mandating. It's here to stay. We don't live in the society where you know everybody anymore. People are very transient, and this is just another way for people to know who the people are that they're looking at hiring. It's really a valuable service. It's very economical, and it can provide a really good or really good red flag for you during the hiring process.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. That's another feature of the small town. Everybody knows everything about everybody, but today it's not true at all.
No, no.
Well, Michelle, I want to thank you for being on the show. It's been interesting.
Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
And I want to thank everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show, and hope you come back next time. Take care.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.